I was very lucky in this episode to speak to Tom Previte. Tom is the founder of Restored, a biochar company based down in Cornwall, and has been a pioneer really in developing biochar as a carbon removal method in the UK, and has won awards for his podcast documenting this journey called Grounded, which I'll link to in the show notes. And it was a really interesting conversation. We discussed not only some of the benefits and issues associated with biochar as a carbon removal method, but we also talked about issues with carbon credits, the voluntary carbon market, and how companies should approach purchasing carbon removal credits. I started by asking Tom to tell us a little bit about Restored.
So, for those that aren't aware of biochar, the way that we like to talk about it is it's this very carbon-rich charcoal-like material. So it looks a lot like charcoal, has sort of similar characteristics of charcoal, but it's not charcoal. We essentially produce this biochar by taking some sort of underutilized or waste biomass stream. So that could be wood chip from tree surgery offcuts. It could be agricultural waste. It could even, in some instances, be manure. And we take that biomass, it's very carbon rich. We heat it to very high temperatures without oxygen, and that is a process known as pyrolysis. And then what we're left up with is this biochar material, which we then crush and process, and then ultimately apply, whether that be through agricultural, sort of applying to soils, or even in some instances, actually using it as a sort of industrial material for concrete or asphalt production.
Yeah, fantastic. And this has been around, like you say before, hasn't it? Biochar production for sort of use in agriculture, hasn't it? Amongst other things, and filtration, I believe. But you're using it for purpose of carbon removal.
Yes. So I think, yeah, if there's probably, I think the earliest evidence of using char-like materials on soils dates back to sort of like the terra preta soils in the Amazon rainforest thousands of years ago.
Really?
And yeah, none of us in the present day can claim that we discovered it first, because I think some indigenous tribes perhaps had the idea long before us. But yeah, the biochar itself can be used in all sorts of different ways, and I think over the last few years, what we've understood is that if we take this biomass, we convert it into biochar, we're essentially locking away carbon in a much more stable form than what it would have otherwise been, let's say, as a wood chip, which would then degrade over a few years and
Mm,
re-release that carbon back into the atmosphere. So, biochar has really taken off in the last few years as a carbon removal method. And the carbon removal doesn't actually happen when we produce the char or do the pyrolysis. The carbon removal happens when the plant photosynthesizes.
yeah.
What we're doing when we make biochar is we're converting it into a more stable form of carbon. So we're increasing or enhancing the durability or the permanence.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that's a really helpful explanation and crucial to differentiate um, from other forms of carbon removal. Just before getting into more about biochar as carbon removal method,
Hmm.
why is it so important? Why did you start this amazing project that you started in Cornwall, trying to produce
Hmm.
biochar as a carbon removal project on a large scale? Um, why should we be concerned about this?
Well, why should we be concerned? Yeah, I mean, these are questions I ask myself. Um,
I'm starting with the
and
little easy ones.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, I mean, yeah, they're all these are all sort of kind of questions to be asking. And there's like when I started Restored and when I started to discover biochar prior to founding Restored, I was asking myself these questions like, what is it about this that makes it so important? And if I can boil it down to a few key things, if we look at our um, if we look at our planet and if we look at the targets that we've set in order to, like the Paris Agreement, looking to cap our emissions, sort of our temperature increase to 1.5 or up to 2 degrees. There is no way, there's no physical way that we can do that without both decarbonizing our economy and at the same time removing CO2 from the atmosphere. For some reason, that carbon removal aspect didn't really get much of a look in um, when when these announcements were made and when these pledges were made, particularly around net zero. I think people just assumed that carbon removal was for like afforestation and reforestation, nature-based carbon removal methods. But
Mm.
it transpires that actually we need to really engineer our way out of this. Decarbonization is not enough on its own. We both need to reduce the emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere, and at the same time, if I liken it to a bathtub, we turn the taps off, but the bathtub is still full, and that bathtub is full of water, or in this instance, greenhouse gases. We've got to pull the plug, and the only way to pull the plug is with carbon removal. Now, biochar is a form of carbon removal, and biochar happens to be a form of carbon removal that makes sense for us to be doing where we are in Cornwall because we've got access to biomass, we're doing it on agricultural land, and the technology is there and available. There are other methods of carbon removal like direct air capture, enhanced rock weathering. So it really is quite context dependent as to what makes sense to do where. But that I think is that's the big that's the North Star with why we're looking at why we're scaling biochar in the UK.
Yeah. And I mean, you've been at the forefront really of piloting this form of carbon removal in the UK. I mean, as you say, the scales at which carbon removal has to happen are so huge globally, talking in the gigatons,
Hmm.
when at the moment it's what would you say? It's, I mean, tens of thousands of tons or very, very small scale, isn't it, at the moment? Um,
Yes, yeah, it's tens or hundreds of thousands of tons um, that are actually happening at the moment that have ever happened. And we need to,
yeah,
yeah, it's a huge challenge. I don't think any industry has ever scaled as rapidly as carbon removal needs to scale.
yeah. Well, that's very interesting that you say that. So, well, that leads to my next key question, which is why is biochar so good? I mean, obviously there are so many challenges. Is it one of the best methods, or is it just that we have to do this along with other methods? How do you approach that?
So if I take off my biochar hat and put on my sort of
Yeah.
put on my carbon removal show hat. So I do another podcast which is called the Carbon Removal Show, and we focus on different technologies and solutions
Mm,
around carbon removal to help us meet our climate goals. And if I put that hat on, which is a bit more sort of taking a broader view of the market, like um, I think every method has its merit. Um, as I said before, a bunch of methods would make sense to do in the UK, and a bunch of them won't make sense to do in the UK. Let's take, um, let's take the example of Climeworks. Climeworks is a direct air capture company. They're one of the sort of they're one of the founding sort of organizations for that solution. It does not make sense to set up direct air capture facilities everywhere. Direct air capture requires a large amount of energy. And if you don't have access to cheap renewable energy, then you're probably doing more harm than good in terms of actually emitting more than you remove. And so Climeworks have looked to locate their direct air capture facilities at locations where there is an abundance of renewable energy. For example, they've got a facility in Iceland, which is powered by a geothermal power plant. So it makes total sense to be doing that there. Similarly, let's take the case of biochar. Biochar doesn't make sense if you have no biomass in your area to use as a feedstock, and or your soils are sort of really high quality because biochar tends to perform better on lower quality soils. I say that I may be shooting myself slightly in the foot because actually the UK is relatively decent at dealing with waste biomass, and by all accounts has good quality soils. But then again, our soils here compared to the rest of the world. But if you do look at what our soils were like, 50 years ago before we really started hammering the ground with kind of more industrial scale practices, they're actually really quite poor. And so in the area that we are, there's a lot of rural, it's a very rural area. We've got access to loads of biomass from tree surgery and ARB teams and also farming practices. There's an abundance of waste biomass available to potentially tap into there. The context makes sense then for us to be kind of producing biochar there. Um, I
Yeah.
wouldn't say that biochar is like the best solution
Mm,
in answer to your question. I think we need different solutions to like in our toolkit in order to tackle this challenge. Firstly, if we're going to get to what some people say this number of removing 10 billion tons by 2050,
mm.
which is what we are predicted that we need to do by the IPCC, give or take. Like, firstly, there's not going to be a single solution that removes all 10 billion tons. Um, Secondly, that's not going to come from one project. It's going to come from multiple different locations and sites as well. I think we need a suite of methods. I'd say biochar is actually the most scalable or is the most scaled to date. And that's because the technology that we use to make biochar, pyrolysis, has been around for a while. We know how to do it. We've been doing it for 20 years in other forms and practices. And so it's just leveraging a technology that already exists as opposed to inventing a new technology like direct air capture. So in the here and now, in the
Mm.
2020s and the 20 in the sort of 2020s to 2030, I think biochar probably will be the sort of front runner. But that may change.
Yeah, and of course, unlike sort of direct air carbon capture and storage, you've got that co-benefit for agriculture as well, haven't you? In the sense that the biochar sort of benefits the soil as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think biochar has this really nice story. And I think something to say here is people buy into stories, right? Like if you're and particularly at this point in time, the way that we scale the carbon removal industry is by getting more buyers, more customers to buy credits and to support the scaling of these technologies. If there are no customers, we won't be able to build an industry of that scale. And we can't just have them all come in 2049 and say, where's our carbon removal? We need to gradually scale that up over time. That's how an industry grows.
Yeah, of course.
Um, but yeah, like biochar has the benefit of having these co-benefits. So not only is it a carbon removal method, it also has benefits for soil in the sense of like biochar. Like I like to describe it sometimes as it acts as a nice hotel for microbes, bacteria, fungi. It's great at retaining water due to its high surface area. It obviously improves the carbon content of the soil due to the fact that, I mean, for one, it's about 85% carbon in some instances, but it also increases the potential absorption capacity of the soil. So it has a whole swathe of potential benefits to improving potentially crop yields, depending on the right biochar in the right place. But then at the same time, also improving the climate resilience of our soils, given we're going to be having more extreme weather conditions. Can only be a good thing.
Yeah, interesting. Is the main limitation then, or one of the biggest ones then, the sourcing? Because my understanding is, if I've understood correctly, is that it's so crucial that sourcing, and I know you talk about this in your podcast as well, that it's
Yes.
the with the wood chip or whatever the biomass that's sourced, it has to have been something that would have emitted already. Or those emissions would have gone out. And so, of course, by storing it in this stable state where it's not going to get re-released, and that's all what the
Yeah.
pyrolysis is about. Thus, you get that truly additional carbon removal. How much of a
Yes.
challenge is that, and how much can that be scaled up? I suppose my key question.
Yeah, well, this is definitely one of the biggest challenges for biochar, finding a sustainable, quote unquote, feedstock or stream of biomass. Um, you're right. You don't want to be logging down woodlands to then turn that into biochar. That's not additional.
Mm,
And and you've got to take into account also sort of counterfactual scenarios. So what would have happened to that biomass if you hadn't intervened with it? And that's when you can hopefully prove the case that you're sourcing it in the right way. So for example, with us, we actually have been taking dead, dying, and dangerous wood that's coming from verges of roadsides and fields, etc., where a tree has died and fallen down, or it's in, or it's been, it is about to. Tree surgery team will come in, they'll chop it up, process it, and then usually what happens is either it's chipped and left in a big pile, which will, in a relatively short time frame, release the majority of the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Or in other instances, you actually can, some people take it away and just, or they either burn it because it's taking up space, or you would use it as in a wood fire. In every case, you're re-releasing that CO2. And so if we can intervene and we can take that and show that we're actually locking the carbon in a more stable form in the form of biochar and giving it a new lease of life, then that's sort of a win. And that's how we want to be sourcing our biomass. And we have any biochar project will have to go through a process of being sort of getting onto a registry, following their protocols, evidencing that you're sourcing your biomass in a sustainable manner, that it is additional, and at the same time, um, going through sort of third party certification
mm.
to basically double check that that you've been doing the maths correctly.
So do you think that in your case, I mean, I know that you're sort of starting to really scale up now, is that um, you're finding that you have enough wood of that sort of sourcing? You think that can be scaled up?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people do a lot of biochar if again if we're taking biochar as the example, a lot of biochar critics will say there's not enough biomass.
Mm, mm,
What I would say to them is that they're not looking in the right places. There actually is plenty of biomass, particularly also in the UK. There are challenges, yes, with certain biomass types, but you can produce biochar from a real myriad of different feedstocks. Like I said before, you can take household green waste and convert that into biochar. You can take anaerobic digestates. You can take all sorts of sort of streams of biomass which are considered wastes, and you can potentially provide an alternative solution that resolves many issues by converting it into biochar. Now, we have challenges here in the UK. The Environment Agency wouldn't permit, or the Environment Agency would class, those products that we're taking as waste streams. And therefore, you need certain permits and licenses, and there are also blockers around how you can then apply that. But long term, that feels like a really viable option to tap into these underutilized waste streams that have really great potential for something like biochar.
yeah, I don't know if this is sort of too technical, but in terms of how you actually describe the removal, I mean, obviously we've got like reducing our decarbonizing our society, right? And then there's sort of this additional removal.
Yeah.
But if a lot of the sort of source of the biomass comes from basic essentially our societal waste effectively, is that like would that be counted as a sort of you're basically helping to accelerate the decarbonization of our society rather than additional removal, or have I just understood that incorrectly? You
Um,
see what I mean?
yeah, no, I sort of see what you mean, and I think there's yeah, there's how would I phrase this? In answer to to your question there, it depends on how you use the carbon on how you utilize the carbon removal benefit.
Mm.
So what you can think about, and if I'm understood you correctly, is sort of um, uh, there's a term called insetting. Now let's take an example of a brewery.
Mm,
A brewery produces beer, and they've got spent grain, potentially spent hops and other material, which is carbon-rich organic biomass. Usually, what happens is the material like that may go to a be or discarded as waste.
mm,
It could go to an incineration site. It could go to a landfill. It could go to a some other process. Ultimately, what happens there is that carbon again is being re-released into the atmosphere.
mm,
And at the same time, you have a brewery which has a supply chain. So they've got farmers growing the crop, and the farmers are then producing emissions by using fertilizer, farming processes, tilling the soil, etc. Insetting comes into play here. For example, when you essentially take the brewery takes matters into their hands. They take, let's say, the waste biomass that they're gathering, and they actually put that biochar back into the soil of the farmers within their supply chain. What they're doing is decarbonizing their own supply chain emissions. They're
yeah.
not technically purchasing a removal credit to offset emissions. They are actually actively decarbonizing their own supply chain. Is that's how I've understood the question. That's sort of a way that you can use it. So you can use certain carbon removal methods as a way to inset and ultimately decarbonize your own supply chain as a business.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it doesn't, in some ways, it's academic, isn't it? Because you're either way, you're sort of you're reducing emissions.
Yeah, it's
But
it, it's either way a ton of CO2 is being removed.
yeah, yeah,
It's just where it's just who's accounting for that and how is it being accounted for.
yeah, and it is just interesting because obviously that, I mean, as the society is under pressure to decarbonize, I suppose in a way that the source might be impacted there as well because they're trying to reduce their waste and so on. But like you say, it's a basket of solutions, isn't it? There's no sort of um, one solution. But yeah, in terms of that broader question, um, when it comes to companies buying carbon removal, do you have any thoughts personally on your experience? I know you worked at a carbon marketplace, carbon credit marketplace beforehand, and
Mm.
what's your view on how companies should approach uh, their claims with respect to decarbonizing and buying removals?
It's yeah, it's a I actually don't think there's a single answer to that. I don't think there's a right answer or a wrong answer. I think there are again a few different approaches that companies can take. And I maybe this is a controversial opinion, and I'd be curious to hear if others feel differently to this, but we've had historically some pretty big sort of scandals in the voluntary carbon market, which is where all of carbon removal operates, and a lot of reduction credits sit. Red Plus, forest protection, ARR, this sort of stuff. Now, there have been articles that have investigative pieces of work that have been undertaken to essentially say that a lot of those reduction credits, so you're not removing your emissions, you're reducing emissions, have been fraudulent or over counted dramatically, and the I guess who takes the flak? It's the buyer. It's the corporate that thinks they're doing a good thing
Mm,
because they've done, they should, should they hire an expert team of certifiers and academics and sort of methodology experts to look into this? Probably not. That's the role of a registry and a standard and ratings agencies. And so, these corporates have made purchases, spent quite a lot of money on these initiatives with a view that they're offsetting their emissions. And people make this case of sort of that's a your what's the word that we always say? The sort of license to pollute sort of dilemma, because it's cheaper to purchase offsets than it is to actually decarbonize if
Mm.
you're purchasing a reduction credit. Nonetheless, companies have spent a lot of money on these projects, and the companies get the flag. The challenge there, though, is that ultimately they did their homework. They bought from AAA rated projects, and they're not going to investigate the registries or the ratings agencies. That's not the company's job. And so I think a lot of them catch a lot of flack for doing what they thought was a good thing.
Yeah,
And off the back of that, I think that's now damaged the voluntary carbon market to a point where companies are so terrified of making purchases in this space, particularly around compensating for their emissions or offsetting residual emissions, because they're afraid of being in this guardian sort of, investigative story, detailing how what they bought was fraudulent.
yeah,
Now, I think there's a way to sort of reframe that either um well I think one way to reframe that, sorry, is it's important for companies to support these initiatives, because if there wasn't that support we wouldn't have an industry, and if we didn't have an industry we won't get to net zero. Perhaps a reframing would be, actually don't think about this as an offset. Think of this as sort of a contribution, as a sort of tax that you want to put on yourself. And there's no linkage to your reduction strategy. That's something that the Science Based Targets Initiative has encouraged. And I think there is still room for improvement there to really encourage companies to start supporting today. But there's definitely a model there that may work.
yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that's sort of like a workaround. Yeah.
That's definitely something that we promote on the Eden's platform as well with all our projects. I think it's that separating out of the taking responsibility for your emissions and saying, these are emissions, but also what can we do to accelerate net zero more broadly, like beyond, like you say. And it's very interesting. I think you're totally right to say that it's wrong to accuse companies of being outwardly malicious. It's not that. It's like you say, it's a nascent field, and of course, projects there are going to be problems with projects. But I suppose that's where biochar comes in, doesn't it? Because this is a very new technology, but also presumably you would say like a lot more watertight in terms of credibility, and it doesn't have those risks. It has that permanence, for example, something we haven't talked about the carbon being locked away
Yeah.
for a long time. That sort of rainforest protection doesn't happen. I mean, it could just be chopped down in 50 years. So
Yeah.
it's helping, isn't it, to have projects like yours?
I think if you're looking at, again, this from a sort of compensation offsetting standpoint, carbon removal is a much more robust path to go down as opposed to purchasing those reduction sort of offsets. So the Red Plus and the Clean Cook Stove initiatives, those don't really have, I think, as much of a place in a offsetting capacity anymore. They are good projects to support if you want to contribute to climate impact, because they're still valuable projects. They have social impact elsewhere as well. But if you're looking from a purely sort of offsetting one emission by removing an emission, so a ton of CO2, then carbon removal is definitely a better way to go forwards. And that's because there's definitely more rigor around the standards and the registries that are underpinning these. And at the same time, it's much more it's much more you're far more likely to prove that the removal happened with a method like biochar, let's say, as opposed to protecting a forest. In that case, let's say you can't guarantee that if you're protecting, 100 acres in one spot, that a forestry company is then sort of deforesting another 100 acres around the corner at double the rate, because they can't get into this area. So that counterfactual is sort of is a challenge there. Whereas with biochar, you don't really have as much of an issue around something like that.
Yeah, yeah. We're almost out of time, but I'd love to just ask you briefly about your own project and how what is next for Restored.
Hmm.
Um, how much are you guys scaling up? And in particular, with the cost side, and biochar credits are notoriously sort of expensive, 150, £200 per ton.
Yeah.
What do you hope to achieve over the next sort of few years?
Yeah, so yeah, where are we now? I mean, we launched Restored in December of 2023. So really we've been going since the start of 2024. So about 18 months. We took a first principles approach to this sort of business, and that basically meant get our hands dirty, start to make small quantities of biochar, get familiar with the process, understand how labor intensive it can be, and really identify the pains and then look to address those as we kind of hopefully scale up. So 2024 was a year of trialing and testing. We had hypotheses around can we make biochar in the UK? Can we source biomass sustainably? Can we find customers, farmers, other users of the biochar? Can we sell the credits? We've managed. I can say that now. We've successfully managed to um, check off a bunch of those. And so 2024 was a year of piloting. 2025 is hopefully a year of scaling. And so we're working with some other local partners in Cornwall to grow this operation, to grow this business, and to set up larger facilities. So we are working towards setting up a sort of 2,000 ton facility. I can't say too much because we've not sort of signed everything off, but that's what we're hoping to sort of go down over the next few months. And in terms of pricing, I think, yeah, like biochar production, carbon removal in general is expensive if you're a customer purchasing the credits. And ultimately, yes, we want to try and bring that cost down over time. But currently that's just because it's
Yeah.
new tech, it costs more money. So yeah, we sold our first batch of credits at £200 a ton. We'd like to be able to bring that down if we can. And over time, eventually see that I think all carbon removal hopefully come to that £100 a ton price point, which feels like a bit of a magic number for many solutions. But that will
Yeah.
take years, if not decades.
It's so fascinating to speak to you, Tom. I think we're out of time, but your project's
Ah,
incredible, and I hope we can speak again when it's increasingly scaled up.
so if anybody does want to, um, I guess, get more familiar with biochar and understand a bit more about sort of how it's produced and how it all works, I had all of these questions when I first started this business a year and a half ago, and there was no information online. And I like podcasting as a format, and I learn quite well through that sort of audio format. And so I thought, well, why don't we just make a podcast documenting our journey? So I recorded literally hundreds of hours worth of content, whether that's conversations with friends and family, conversations to myself about sort of, trials and tribulations and sort of doubts, to conversations with farmers and credit buyers, those early conversations that you have, which are sort of quite formative in how we think about things. And we've stitched that all together into a 10-part sort of 30-minute episode series, which is out on any podcasting platform that you want to listen to. Go check it out, give it a listen. It's called Grounded, a Climate Startup Journey. We have actually won a couple of awards for the podcast. I didn't even know podcasting had an awards sort of thing with it, but turns out there are a bunch of different awards out there, and we've won a couple. So we're really proud of it, and it's a great way to get up to speed with sort of biochar and carbon removal in the UK in particular.
I'll definitely put that in the show notes so that people can have a look at your podcast. But yeah, just to say again, thanks again, Tom, for coming on the show.
No, thank you, Sam. Real pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation online.